Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Gwen and today I'm going to be doing a review on The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang because that's the only book I read in July. I feel like a lot of people have hit a reading slump this month precisely. Like I've seen it so much on Twitter of people being like, hey, it's okay if you haven't read a book at all this month, or if you picked up a book, congrats, that's more than I've done. It just seems like everyone's in the same boat. So with that being said, let's talk about The Poppy War, because even though it's the only book I read this month, it got 5 stars. So here's the physical copy that I read, and overall I gave this book 5 stars because it really captivated everything that I love in a story. I really loved the character. I really loved the overall pacing of the book. I really liked where the character went. I really liked how much of the world we got to see by the end of this book. And I really liked the cliffhanger. I had a really great time reading this book overall. And so now I'm going to get a little bit more into the details as to why. This is the point where if there are spoilers, I will put them on the bottom of the screen and give you a timestamp to forward through if you don't want to hear spoilers. But I'm going to try to keep this review as spoiler-free as possible. So, Rin is our protagonist, and she is the individual we follow through the majority of the book and have her POV from. And the book is separated into 3 parts. The first part is kind of meeting Rin, what kind of life she has in poverty with being in the black market because her adoptive family is in the black market, and the way she's going to get out of that is through acing this test but also being the best of this test so she can get into a school where she doesn't have to pay anything. And I think we meet Rin when she's 14. I think we meet her 16 taking the test but 14 for the first chapter, if that makes sense. There's a little bit back and forth in the first chapter of her taking the test, but also the reflection of 2 years before, how she decided she's going to take this test and also ace the crap out of it. Like, she really wants to get out of this place. So this isn't a spoiler. She does get in. And at this point in the book, I was like, of course she's going to get in. Like, this isn't going to be an interesting story unless this girl beats the odds and completely surpasses anybody of importance in this South Rooster. I think she was in the Rooster section. Yeah, I think she's in the Rooster section of the world. I really had a mind blank there. So that's where that starts off with, and we progressively move through her story of being at school, and that's pretty much all of part 1. You get to the end of it, and we have had hits in the last chapter of the coming of another war. That's the first part. And what I loved about this part is following Rin as she grows up and also getting more of her personality coming through. She's very much a character, a person who, if you tell her that she can't do something, she's gonna do it times like 1,000 more than you thought she could ever do. She just pushes the boundaries. And it's sometimes to a point where it's very traumatic for her, but she doesn't realize that. It can be to a point where it's abusive towards herself. And as a reader reading this and knowing that there's 2 more books in the series and that we're still gonna probably follow Rin into her 20s, as an adult, there's this like fear in me of like, how is she gonna deal with all of this later in life? Because she at some point has to realize that there's abuse involved. Like, where is the mental, emotional therapy happening? Who is she talking to about her emotions? It really comes across as though she doesn't really talk to anybody about how she's feeling. She just is doing the things she's doing. And some people call her out on her feelings, and other people just completely ignore it and push her buttons usually, rather than trying to help her, which again creates a very different character and one that is more combative. She's always on the offensive side, Rin. She never has backed down, really. At this point, let's talk a little bit about the magic system. So Rin in her studies gets appointed to someone who never has students, and she decides to pursue and go under his tutory. Is that what it is? Teachings. Under his teachings, and proceeds to learn more about the gods and spirituality and how the earth works and how people can actually use magic and morph the world on their own will if they just knew about it. So I loved this part. I loved learning about it. Rin, of course, gets very upset about how much she has to write essays versus actually doing something with what she's learning. And there's a back and forth with that I really love, and the understanding of you have to learn a lot before you can practice, because it's a very dangerous thing to do, because you're essentially talking to the gods when you start practicing. So the one thing about the magic system that I also want to bring up as a last point is that we really don't get a clear and concise way on how to control the magic. We see it from Rin's perspective of other people using this type of magic and how they control it, but she herself, since we're from only her perspective, it's wild, and she still doesn't know how to physically hone it in so it can do small things instead of just abruptly erupt out of her and harm anybody in its way. I'm thinking in the next couple of books she's going to harness it more, but for right now, in the first book, it was very much raw power that she didn't understand how to control. I feel like if I talk about the second and third parts in too much detail, we're going to get a lot of spoilers. But in essence, the war starts to happen and Rin has to leave her studies and be put into the military sooner than was expected. I think by the end of part 1, I think she's been in school for about 3 years and she's supposed to be in school for 5 years. So they just kind of fast-tracked all of them to go into the war to help go against these other people. So we do have a lot of characters that we interact with, but for the most part, they're pretty memorable, and I didn't find any characters that were brought up later in the book to be like, wait, who the hell are you? All of them have the rightful place in this book, and I didn't hate most of the side characters that were added into this. I think a lot of them, they have certain points and qualities, teachings that Rin has learned from them, and I think throughout the story that's really important in understanding where Rin's thought process has gone on. So let's talk about trigger warnings. I think this book has been said to have all of the trigger warnings that you can imagine. And I wanted to speak on these because I didn't know that this was known about this book until I was halfway through. I was about to start part 3 and I look and see a tweet of someone else who's currently reading the Poppy War, and they said, wow, everyone was right. Trigger warnings, all of them for part 3. And in my head, there's already stuff that's already happened that's trigger warning worthy in this book. But I think what a lot of people were trying to mention about part 3 is that you get the reality of war right in your face in part 3. But I do also want to mention there's trigger warnings for part 1, part 2, just as much as there is for part 3. And the two that I want to mention, self-harm and drug usage. And self-harm was a way in order for which Rin to study. So it only sticks around for the time frames of schooling, which is part 1. Drug usage is kind of actually throughout the entire book. The drug usage wasn't, I guess explicit would be the word I would say. It isn't very detailed, but Rin eventually will be using drugs. So again, if that makes you kind of unsettled or is too much of a trigger, then I definitely wouldn't read this book, because that's throughout every single part of the book. You can't just like skim it. So that's those two trigger warnings I would say overall. Now for part 3 specifically, the trigger warnings would be just a blanket statement of war. If you've never read anything detailed about war before, this might throw you off exceptionally, but it's pretty much talking about the dead, about torture, about executions, about burnings, and we do have rape, and we do have torture and rape as well. There's no easy way to talk about triggers, but honestly, they need to be known. If you're going to read this book, you should know the trigger warnings on it. Some other things of note that I just wanted to mention in this book that I think was done so well. I really love the way history was brought into this book and how the world building developed over time. You get a lot of it in the first half because Rin is at school and Rin doesn't know the full history of her world. She knows like the basics and the folklore stories that are told about how this country became free again and not under rule of another state, but she doesn't know the details of all of it, and she never heard about certain massacres that are very, very important into the ending of the book. And because of all of this, we get racism, we get sexism, we get classicism, and we get all the isms, really. Anything you can think of, this book really talks about. And Rin is very much the forefront of like why, like in history class, she'll ask the questions or say things that most people wouldn't say because she wants to know why certain people are being hated against just by the color of their skin or how they work with their own gods or, you know, implementation of different war efforts. She asks all of those serious questions, and the masters of the school never have a really great answer. And as a reader, it's really great to see this back and forth, and again, the development of Rin and how she understands the world that she's living in and how she's going to defend the world when she becomes a soldier for her people. How is she going to be a better soldier than the rest? How is she going to defend the people that look more like her versus the milky white complexion of the royal lineages? There's a lot here that needs to be digested and more deep dive into, and I would love to talk to people more about the other themes, the underlining themes in this book series, and what else some of these characters amplify, what they objectify, what they stand for. I think can be really, really great discussion topics, but also really great learning places for readers as well. So with that being said, that was a really long review for one book, but I did really love it a lot, and there's a reason why, and it's because all of these things made me enjoy this book so much that I gave it 5 stars. So it's worth the read, it's worth getting through all the pain that you will read in this book. But I think understanding this character and growth of this character is really, really important. So that is the end of this review. Thank you so much for listening and staying all the way through it. I know it's kind of a long one. So now I wanted to finish off saying I want to finish the Dragon Republic in August. As you can tell, I have barely read anything, so please be gentle with me. We will finish it. We will finish it because the Burning God is coming in November and I want to read it as well. So we gotta finish this before then. Again, thank you so much for watching to the end of this video. As always, linked down below are ways in which we can all help the Black Lives Matter movement, along with worldwide things that are happening that also need our attention, donations, signatures for things. And if you'd like to follow me anywhere else on social media, those links are also down below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!